copious amounts of equipment that can be acquired throughout each quest. Some pieces can be found, others purchased, and yet others still acquired after performing great feats. And the collection of such equipment can often be one of the most important factors in determining not just the relative strength of a party, but also whether they will be able to overcome what challenges lay in wait. Weapons are a crucial component of this, and in relation to Final Fantasy, when looking at the entire breadth of games available, there have literally been thousands of different weapons introduced across a plethora of categories. From swords through to axes, wands, and even some of the more unorthodox weapons like boomerangs and bells, each category has featured weapons of incredible power. But some have broken the confines of their initial appearance, becoming recurring weapons that have gained legendary status due to their application or association with certain characters. And it's those weapons that we're going to be taking a look at today, as after another hard-fought vote, our Patreon supporters suggested that we produce a video where we take a detailed look at 7 weapons that, since their introduction, have gone on to become legendary. And we're going to kick things off with the Masamune. The concept of ultimate weapons was introduced in Final Fantasy I, and one of the 2 weapons that could be considered an ultimate weapon was the Masamune. Appearing alongside Excalibur, the Masamune was defined as a legendary katana without peer, and it could be found hidden deep within the Chaos Shrine. Outside of its attack power, accuracy and critical hit chance, what separated the Masamune from all the other weapons featured in Final Fantasy I was that it could be equipped by any job, making it very useful for turning even white mages into huge physical damage dealers. The role of the Masamune was then similar in Final Fantasy II, as it again appeared as the de facto ultimate weapon, but in the games that followed, even though it was still put on a pedestal from a narrative perspective, its relative power started to diminish. In Final Fantasy III, the Masamune appeared as one of the weapons that could be found in Eureka, and in Final Fantasy V it was one of the sealed weapons, but in neither game was it considered to be an ultimate weapon, and a new weapon called Ragnarok often appeared as its superior. This was also the case in Final Fantasy IV, where Masamune appeared as Edge's ultimate weapon, but it was relatively quite weak in comparison to Ragnarok, Cecil's ultimate weapon. Final Fantasy VI then took things a bit further, relegating the Masamune to a mid-tier weapon for Cyan. But all would be forgiven with its appearance in Final Fantasy VII, which is where its legendary status was cemented. Even though Masamune was not a weapon obtainable by the player, it appeared as the signature weapon of Sephiroth, the game's main antagonist. Modelled after an Adachi blade, the sword was ridiculously long, and the developers made sure to emphasise its strength and importance, including it in pivotal moments of the experience. Perhaps due to its levels of prominence, the Masamune did not feature in Final Fantasy VIII, and although it did appear in Final Fantasy IX, it did so as a thief sword that was interestingly overshadowed by Ultima Weapon, Cloud's ultimate weapon. But
if you want to restore your perfect vision, with something that has never been done before, in record time and for the rest of your life, then you need to see this. Harvard scientists confirmed for the first time ever that vision problems are not caused by genetics or aging, but by dangerous microbiomes that actually suffocate your eyes, and which increase the risk of blindness by over 97%.
But after that, it was Auron's celestial weapon, the Empyrean weapon for samurais in Final Fantasy XI, and the ultimate katana in the original version of Final Fantasy XII. Since then though, the appearance of the Masamune has been somewhat diminished. Final Fantasy XIII did not feature the weapon at all, though it did later appear in Lightning Returns, and in Final Fantasy XV it was available as a pre-order bonus that was quite weak in comparison to other weapons available to Noctis. It has also not yet appeared in Final Fantasy XIV, which is quite surprising, but who knows what will happen in the future. Even still, due to the prominence of Sephiroth, the Masamune stands as one of the most iconic weapons to have ever appeared in the franchise, and its many other appearances, even when it has been the strongest weapon in the game, ended up being eclipsed. Even though the Masamune was the ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy I and II, it would soon be superseded by a weapon that was introduced in Final Fantasy III, although the process was not immediate. Ragnarok first appeared alongside Masamune as one of the weapons available in Eureka, but it was more powerful, offering more attack and a +5 boost to all stats, as opposed to the Masamune, which only boosted agility. The difference became more pronounced in Final Fantasy IV, as Ragnarok appeared as not only the ultimate weapon for Cecil, but in terms of its raw strength, it was also the most powerful weapon in the game. Not only did it have the highest base attack, but it also boosted stats and provided an elemental affinity. Ragnarok then broke away from the Masamune in Final Fantasy V to become something special. The 2 previous games have seen Ragnarok and Masamune fit within the same classification, with Ragnarok being a stronger alternative due to its class and character associations. But in Final Fantasy V, whereas Masamune was a sealed weapon, Ragnarok was the reward for beating Shinryu, and it was not only the strongest sword, but also the strongest weapon in the game. Final Fantasy VI saw the divide further, as Ragnarok was the most powerful weapon that could be obtained through conventional means.
Ну это все как бы игрушка всего лишь. Детская графика, все дела. Да. Ну наоборот, вот это он имеет в виду, наоборот. Ну да, тогда. Ну да, да. Наверное, нет, понял. Да, тогда это есть он самый, да. Вроде. Да, вот это есть он самый. Да, да. Ну да, типа того. Ну, он здесь. Да. Да. Ну да, так вот это и есть на самом деле. Ну да, да. Да. Да нет, вот это и есть на самом деле. Так на, вот она имеет в виду. Поэтому да. А, ну вот это и ну сам. Ладно, да. Да, жестко пока, жестко себе, да. Пока допускают. Да. Ну да, да. Ну наоборот тут. Ну наоборот, да. Ну типа этого, да. Ну подумаешь. Слушай, так холодно уже стало.
Masamune, but it was still less powerful than the Lightbringer and Ultima Weapon. From that point onward, Ragnarok would often be there or thereabouts in terms of power. It was a strong sword for Cloud in Final Fantasy VII, as well as for Knights in Tactics, and for most people, it would have been the strongest weapon available for Steiner in Final Fantasy IX. Ragnarok also appeared as a relic weapon in Final Fantasy XI and a Zodiac weapon in Final Fantasy XIV. But even though its importance was diminished in other numbered games like Final Fantasy X and XII, its importance in Final Fantasy IV, VI, XI and XIV, as well as its enduring nature as a top-tier weapon in many other games, has cemented the legacy of Ragnarok. Our next weapon also doubles up as one of the most famous abilities in the franchise, and both are often associated with Odin. The Zantetsuken ability first appeared in Final Fantasy III, and was used by Odin to bring about instant death to all susceptible enemies. It appeared again in Final Fantasy IV and V, as well as VI, and each time it did so as a powerful move associated with the summonable entity. Final Fantasy VI, however, also had an obtainable weapon called Zantetsuken, and there were two possible sources for this acquisition. One required the Blue Dragon to be defeated, and the other involved betting the Lightbringer at the Colosseum. Although its power wasn't as good as some of the other available weapons, Zantetsuken did have some useful secondary benefits. It would allow the wielder to use the Bushido and Runic commands, and there was also a 25% chance of it insta-killing its target, even affecting the undead. Zantetsuken would next appear as an obtainable weapon in Final Fantasy XI as a reward for those who defeated Odin Prime. There was also another version available called Zantetsuken X. The initial weapon was a sword with a whole host of stat boosts, including the Death Status effect, and it could be equipped by warriors, Dark Knights and Blue Mages. The X variant was then a great sword equipable by Paladins, Dark Knights and Rune Fencers, but it didn't have the additional death effect. as it was instead replaced with the ability for the weapon to sometimes nullify an enemy's defense.
Quels sont les métiers les mieux payés sur Terre? Médecins, avocats ou encore chimistes? Ces personnes touchent en moyenne un salaire de 7 000 € par mois. Ils ont
Final Fantasy XIV has also featured an iteration of Zantetsuken that could be obtained as a reward for defeating Odin, but it was nowhere near as strong as the version seen in Final Fantasy XI. Perhaps the most noticeable occurrence of a playable character wielding Zantetsuken came in Final Fantasy XIII, a game that did not feature either the Masamune or the Ragnarok. When Odin was summoned and subsequently entered into its Gestalt mode, Lightning would wield the legendary sword. But even still, Zantetsuken has become legendary in its own right purely because of its long-standing association with Odin, an incredibly powerful summon that's featured in many, many games over the years. Ultima Weapon first appeared in Final Fantasy VI alongside the Lightbringer as one of the two ultimate weapons that supplanted Ragnarok, and it was quite unique. It could be found in the Cave with the Sealed Gate, was equipable by Terra, Locke, Edge and Celes, and even had its own backstory. It was said that the Ultima Weapon was forged during the War of the Magi as a magical weapon that would reflect the power of the one who wielded it, and that then played out into its damage output. Ultima Weapon had 255 attack power, but its damage output was based on the level of the character equipping the weapon. Attack power, but its damage output was based on the level of the character equipping the weapon, as well as comparing the current HP to their maximum HP. Ultima Weapon also had a sprite that would then reflect the potential damage output, with the blade's length decreasing as potential damage also decreased. Ultima Weapon then retained its position as an ultimate weapon in Final Fantasy VII, as it appeared as the most powerful weapon that Cloud could wield, and its damage was again based on current HP against maximum HP, with Ultima Weapon at its optimal damage output when Cloud was at maximum health. As in the previous game, the weapon's visual style changed to represent potential damage, but this time it was denoted by the colour of the blade as opposed to its length. Ultima Weapon was not obtainable in time it was denoted by the colour of the blade as opposed to its length. Ultima Weapon was not obtainable in Final Fantasy VIII, although it was wielded by Ultima Weapon, but its status as an ultimate weapon was retained in Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X. Not only was it the most powerful weapon available to Zidane, but it was also Tidus' celestial weapon in the Japanese version, as well as the Italian, French, Spanish and German versions, but for some reason in the English version it was changed from Ultima Weapon to Kalabog. Ultima Weapon did not appear in Final Fantasy XI or XII, and it has yet to appear in Final Fantasy XIV, but it did appear in Revenant Wings as Bahn's ultimate weapon outside of the Anastasia. This retained its prominent status, but that status was then diminished in Final Fantasy XIII as Ultima Weapon was superseded by its super boss big brother, Omega Weapon. Both were weapons available for Lightning to wield, but Ultima Weapon was the weapon that needed to be transmuted in order to create Omega Weapon, Lightning's ultimate weapon. As a complete aside here, perhaps due to its prominence in Final Fantasy VI, VII and X, where Nomura was a prominent part of the creative team, Ultima Weapon is often the strongest keyblade available to protagonists in the Kingdom Hearts franchise, and this trend continued in Kingdom Hearts 3. Save the Queen gained significant status due to its appearance in Final Fantasy IX, but what's interesting is that unlike many of the other weapons we've featured so far, it first appeared outside of the numbered series. Final Fantasy Tactics featured an expanded roster of jobs, and it meant that alongside the regular Knight and Dark Knight, there were also Holy Knights, Templars, Sword Saints and Divine Knights. Each was able to equip Knight swords, and one of them, which could be found in Midlight Steep, was called Save the Queen. It was quite weak in comparison to other swords in the same category, like Excalibur and Ragnarok, but Save the Queen was useful as it granted auto-protection to the wielder. Save the Queen next appeared in Final Fantasy VIII, but it was no longer a sword. Instead, it was a whip, and it served as Quistis' ultimate weapon. Given that Hiroyuki Ito was a prominent member of the team that worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, it made sense that Save the Queen next appeared in Final Fantasy IX, a game he was directing. And here, it retained its association with Holy Knights, as it was the weapon of choice of Beatrix, a notable paladin who was formidable in combat. Even though its base attack power was quite weak, Save the Queen featured a unique algorithm that based its damage output on character level, and if Beatrix was above level 85, it would make Save the Queen one of the strongest weapons in the game. After Final Fantasy IX, outside of Final Fantasy X, where it appeared as either a decent sword for Tidus or a rod for Yuna, depending on which localization you were playing, Save the Queen has continued to appear as a weapon associated almost exclusively with paladins and knights. Final Fantasy XII featured it as a great sword, and its relative strength was similar to what was seen in Tactics, and it also appeared in Revenant Wings as an exclusive sword for Barsh. Its appearance in Final Fantasy XIII echoed Final Fantasy VIII. Save the Queen was the ultimate weapon for Snow, who was associated with the Sentinel role, but it was no longer a sword. Final Fantasy XIV then took things to another level, as although it wasn't obtainable as a weapon, Save the Queen was an important weapon in the context of the story, and it has featured in Shadowbringers as an optional storyline. The penultimate weapon on our list, the revolver, became iconic following its initial appearance in Final Fantasy VIII, as it was the weapon associated with Squall Leonhardt. Within the lore of Final Fantasy VIII, few are able to master the revolver's overriding gunblade weapon class due to its dual application, and we got to understand why once players got to use Squall and Cypher in combat, as the dual application manifested through an interactive gameplay mechanic. This allowed the gun to be fired after the blade had swiped, something that meant both characters could never miss, even if blinded. What's interesting is that unlike many of the other weapons on this list, Revolver was Squall's weakest weapon. But due to its visual style and prominence within various cutscenes, including the awe-inspiring opening sequence, it has persisted in popular culture much longer than Squall's ultimate weapon, Lionheart. Following the release of Final Fantasy VIII, it has been difficult for creators to replicate the weapon, as its design was so cemented in people's minds. They created variants of Gunblade, such as the Velvet Nightmare, a weapon used by Yazoo and Loz, as well as Vice's rifle katanas, but no creator has been brave enough to try and reinvent the revolver. The closest we've got, outside of the special ceremonial item that came as part of the Shadowbringers Collector's Edition, was one of Balthier's guns, called the Ras Algethi, but that was only close in visual design, not naming convention. And that brings us on to the final entry in our list, the Buster Sword, which serves as a nice counterbalance to our first weapon in this video, the Masamune. Much like the Gunblade, the Buster Sword has such an iconic association with Cloud Strife that it's been difficult for it to appear anywhere as anything other than a tribute. It was also the weakest sword available for Cloud to use, but its legendary status has really been connected to the lore of Final Fantasy VII, something that was expanded upon in significant fashion following the release of Crisis Core. Here we learned that the original owner of the Buster Sword was Angeal Hewley, who passed it down to Zack Fair as a symbol of his honour and dreams. Zack then passed the sword down to Cloud in a similar manner. Both Angeal and Zack used the Buster Sword exclusively, serving as evidence for its power, and it's helped to add to its legendary status, which was already established following that initial appearance. Outside of Final Fantasy VII, the Buster Sword has appeared in a few games, but they have always paid tribute to the original version. Tactics Advance and its sequel, for example, had it as an equipable weapon for those using the Soldier class, as well as similar classes like Warrior and Dragoon, and Lightning Returns had it appear as a piece of downloadable content. It has also appeared in Final Fantasy XIV as part of the Braver and Blade Dance limit breaks, but like the Revolver, no creator has been brave enough to try and reinvent the Buster Sword, and it's doubtful that any ever will. But yeah, with that, I think we're done. They were 7 weapons that after their initial appearance have gone on to become legendary. Let us know in the comments below which weapon you feel is the most legendary and iconic, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to accept
Блин, все, загружать. Смотри, что ты смотришь по телевизору? Кто тебе сказал, что это говно вообще можно смотреть? Почему бы тебе не поиграть в игру, например? Как пример тебе говорю. Наоборот просто. Ну, тебя просто понял. Ну, я просто так, ну, он понимает тебя просто. То есть, в принципе, когда он тебя просто о себе не говорил. Он тебя просто не говорил. Это... ну нет, это он тебе. У меня вот на телевизор, я не буду тут ничего, тут это не хорошо, не плохо, просто, как это сказать-то? Не то что аллергия, а как это вот объяснишь-то? У меня смутное чувство, когда я смотрю телевизор, у меня как бы, да. Не то, что я теряю времени, типа, ну, как бы, как помойка, что ли. Ну, не знаю, без всяких красивых, я просто, ну, короче говоря, что, да, то есть это не то, на что можно тратить время, как бы, да, понимаю, своей единственной жизнью, да, понимаю, да, особенно мужчине. Насчет женщины я не знаю, а если у нее нормально все, я не знаю, там. Ну, то есть, типа, ну, она имеет в виду наоборот, да. Только если у тебя все время с похмелья голова болит, да. Да, понимаю, да. Что практически у большой массы, наверное, судя по тому, что, ну, наверное, это не суть разговора. Я тоже по себе помню, что когда такой, как бы, да, в твоей единственной жизни еще раз. Понимаю, а чтобы выйти из похмельного синдрома, лично я, это моя засечка, да, он тебя понял, да. То есть, ну, я тебе ничего не навязываюсь, просто я тебе говорю, как бы, что, ну, а может и нет, тебе виднее. Ну, наоборот, значит, ну, я просто о себе говорю, да, наоборот, да. Аттракции, да. Наоборот, с ютубом так иногда тоже, но не всегда, не иногда вообще. Чтобы не было такой фобии, что ли. Да старая просто совесть, да старая просто совесть. Я даже фильмы не смотрю сейчас. Так это какой-то вот, ну да, ну наоборот, он это имеет в виду, что это тебя развивает, что ли. Потому что наоборот. маленький, ты ничего не можешь произвести, понимаешь? И для тебя кажется, все, да, понимаешь, что все вообще просто, что все производится тобой, да. Все думают.